Hello, everyone. I'm Mike.
I'm Shannon.
We
And
are the First Gen Docs.
I will kick off by sharing that I was born in New York City and actually grew up in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And we found our ways to Connecticut because, and this is part of my first gen journey. It's because my mom played D3 basketball for a community college in Connecticut, and was in many ways, even though it was D3, she was recruited, and there was a whole big operation
Wow.
around. The coach was all in to getting his team to become a championship team, and they actually did. We moved from New York City to Connecticut when I was 7 for that opportunity for her, and she was in many ways a first generation college student. So I got to see a little bit about her college experience as a young kid, and was really my introduction to college. And for me, honestly, I was like, all right, I want to go there because it only made sense, right? Because I was seeing her really live out her athletic dreams. And then I'm like, well, and me and my brother, we're on college campuses, and we were hanging out in the dorms, and all those things. And so it was pretty interesting to kind of see that experience through her. But yeah, so I grew up in Connecticut, and then found my way to Boston for undergrad. I went to Wheelock College in Boston. It's a small school. I was definitely looking forward to a small school coming from a city. Bridgeport is a city in Connecticut. And so I think I graduated with 500 people. We were one of 4 high schools in the city. So, pretty, a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I was like, I want to go to a small school. For me, being able to see how I could really hone in on that community, right? That community experience. All of our teachers, we got to call them by their first name, right? It was a very comfortable environment. And I actually wanted to be a 4th grade teacher, which is why I went to Wheelock.
I was born in the Philippines, and when I was about 18 months old, I joined my mom, who came to the United States under a program where they were looking for nurses. So at the time, there was a nursing shortage, and my mom was a nurse in the Philippines. She got a job in a hospital in Harlem.
Oh, wow.
And so she petitioned for the family to come over. My dad came over, and he never practiced what he studied accounting, but he got a job at the mailroom at Estee Lauder. So his job was very blue collar. My mom's job was very blue collar. And we lived in a small apartment in the Upper East Side. And then we moved again into Queens, which is where I grew up. And a lot of the conversation around first gens was around, lack of exposure to college. And some folks would say that my parents had exposure to college, but not in the same way, not the exposure to college in the United States. So there is in a lot of ways, we are sort of first gen adjacent.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, I didn't share. My mom didn't finish, right? So she didn't finish college. So she got recruited to play basketball for this community college, ended up transferring to a 4-year college. So the community college was in New Haven, Connecticut. So this coach would drive the team back and forth because all of them were living in Bridgeport, which is about half an hour away. And, again, he got his championship, and then it was 2, they graduated, and my mom actually went on to a 4-year school, University of Bridgeport, so closer to where we were living. Yeah. But again, wasn't able to really understand the college nuances, right? And again, really was there for athletics, right? And didn't know how to, do both, I don't think, or was guided to do both. So yeah, to your point, definitely adjacent, right? Because in many ways, I didn't reap the benefits of her being in college. I just saw her in college, right? And I'm like, oh, well, this is what you do.
you were in the United States, live the American dream. You go to high school, then you go to college. Okay. But there was no real sort of what to look out for me.
Oh.
I went to school, I guess like like many first gens. I went to school close by. I went to college in Brooklyn.
Okay.
And it was a Brooklyn Polytechnic at the time, which eventually over time merged with NYU. So that was in Brooklyn. I took the train for an hour to get to school every day. It was good in math and science. And I went to the library. I got one of those big books that says, what kind of career do you think you should go into?
Yeah.
But I didn't have like the kind of counseling or people to ask about what kind of careers you could have after college. My mom was a nurse. Everyone she knew were nurses and doctors. And I knew that I didn't want to be that. And I didn't want to work in the mailroom with my dad. So I really just had to kind of pick a career out of a book. So I studied engineering.
Oh, wow. Well, what a good one to pick.
It was a shot in the dark. I figured, I like science fiction. And so I figured they make stuff, right? Okay, let's do that.
Yeah.
I did that and I realized that, that wasn't exactly the fit either. Really, a lot of the things that I could have benefited from would have been some additional counseling. If you go to engineering school and you decide you don't want to be an engineer, there's not much else you could do.
I'm right there with you on I went to a niche school on education. The whole school the mission was improving the lives of children and families, right? And so it was education, social work, juvenile justice is like working in the juvenile system with youth, and child life, so working in the hospital with sick kids. And so it was all about like nurturing fields and totally fine, but also like, what do you do if you get 2 years in and you're like, I don't want to do that. Which in some ways was me. Different than you kind of being like, I'm going to pick a shot in the dark. I always had it in my mind, I'm going to be a teacher, right? It was just, I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to be a teacher. Like, I just was like, I like school and I enjoy teaching, and from what I thought of it, right? I'm like, I could do this, right? That was my thinking. And to your point, I didn't really have any guidance. Even though my mom went to college, there was no like, here's what you do in your essay, right? Here's how you talk to financial aid. Here's how you negotiate. Here's how you think about picking a school. It was like, I want to leave Connecticut.
How do you go about picking a school? That was a huge one, because all I had were my fellow classmates in high school who were like, oh, well, let's choose these schools. And people who were, like if they were into, sports, they were choosing certain schools. They were into math and science. There was like a handful of schools. And then I had to narrow it down to the ones that were close to where I lived, because I needed to be close to home. The Venn diagram of all of that narrowed down to choices in my mind I thought were, one or two schools. And if I were to advise someone now, I would have chosen maybe something slightly different. Yeah. Something a little broader, something with a little more scope. I think there was a huge push to try and go to a 4-year college when I could have just as easily gone to a 2-year college to figure myself out. There was also a huge push to finish in 4 years. It was an arbitrary number. Not knowing about college and treating it the same as high school, it was like, well, you graduate high school in 4 years, so you should graduate college in 4 years, otherwise you are left back.
Right.
I didn't know that lots of people finish college in 5 and 6 years. Yeah. That's with no stigma. That's normal. I took a very hard road out of college, finishing in 4 years, but not as the scholar that I thought I was.
Yeah.
But as somebody who barely managed to eke by, because I was packing in 18 to 21 credits in a semester because I was catching up.
You bring up a great point about what the journey could look like, and that would be advice I would share. I think you bring up a great point on the journey towards college. And I share this when I talk to high school students as they're preparing for college. I'm like, you don't have to do the prescribed route, right? And especially if you're a first generation college student, you should be thinking critically about how much college costs these days, right? And like how to do it in the most affordable way. if you want to do it, but you can do it in a way that doesn't put you in debt. And that's something that I didn't really understand, right? I just was like, I have to go. I just have to be there. I just have to go to this school. I have to get the degree and I have to finish. Doesn't really matter what it cost in the end, right? And honestly, years later, still paying, right? And so I think you can think differently about, hey, if I really don't know also what I want to do, let me take a gap year. Let me, go to a community college, which is much more affordable. Stay closer to home. It doesn't have to be forever, because I do think when you're 18, you're like, this is my time. I need to go, right? Like, but there's so much time to go and fly, right? But I think in this critical time, use the assets you have, which is, and I think what you did also probably connects to that, is like, let me stay close to home. Let me save, likely, right? Like save up, or don't spend as much, right? Because I'll tell you, I came to Boston, but I was living off work study, right? For many years, and that's only so much. And I had to think about going to class, trying to graduate and do well in school, make friends, and then also work maybe 2 or 3 jobs.
Circling back to that point, it's making those choices, because there were times, and I'd seen some classmates who they were sort of unsure as well, and we were all trying to get through. I was fortunate enough to have a scholarship, but others were paying full freight to go to a private school for a degree that they were unsure of, because they felt that was what they had to do. If I were to choose differently, if I were to advise differently, I would say, hey, there's no one forcing you to finish in 4 years, other than the pressures you feel within yourself, and then perhaps maybe the whatever your peer group or your parents understand.
Yeah.
And things can be explained. If you take 5 years, you don't have to put so much pressure on yourself. You could stretch the money out a little bit and actually do better in school with a little more thought as to where you want to go afterwards.
Yeah. It's societal pressure, and not jumping ahead a bit, more to come on this topic, but doing research on this topic, when talking to students, it was like, I didn't want to be left out of the crowd, right? Like, if everyone is going to these private schools, and that's really a huge bragging right at that moment, right, of being a high school graduate. Where are you going? Like, what are you studying? All those things, I think, is a lot of pressure. And then especially when you're first gen, because if in some ways nobody else around you has gone through that particular journey, and so they're like even more excited to ask you these questions and to push you out the door for your own benefit, but also like no real guidance.
No, you're absolutely right with that. And I, now I remember being one of the few in my neighborhood who went the college route. Oh, he knows what he's doing. He's going to do this. I remember thinking to myself, going, I guess. Or, yes, I'm ready to do these things. And then the first obstacle I found, it threw me for a loop, because I thought that, I had it all figured out, and college is a different game, and not even knowing that other people had felt the same way.
Yeah.
I thought that this was a thing that I had to suffer all on my own.
Yes.
And so I would take that burden onto myself. It was almost a silent burden, because I couldn't talk to anybody at home either. I was keeping up appearances at school. It's the sort of the dual world that first gen students feel, and again, alluding to the future with research, exactly what experience that first gen students experience across the board.
The dual role is exactly that, right? Like the dual life, right? And even without taking that piece that you're sharing about like keeping up appearances, or trying to figure it out, even like kind of faking it, right? Even though you're like, I don't know what I'm doing, for both sides, right? Because your family is like, oh yeah, everything's great. I know what I'm doing, maybe not. for your
Yeah.
friends or your, people at school, you're like, I know what I'm doing. This is the path, maybe not. But then all of those other things around, again, that pressure that might have come from maybe a neighborhood where it's like, oh, Mike's out there, right? And then having to live up to that, or also sometimes combating like, oh, folks aren't excited, right? They're like, this is, oh, you've changed, right? Because you are at this college now, right? So all these like things that you're having to navigate with no real roadmap, because you're just getting hit with all these different feelings, and you're like, well, what is right? Like what?
Yeah.
I just was curious. You mentioned your journey after undergrad was a bit startling, because I think you mentioned like you had pressures about finishing in 4 years. So then I guess maybe how did that turn out?
Sure.
Yeah.
So my dad got cancer in like my senior year of college. And so, and he died right before I graduated.
Oh, wow.
So the pressure for me was to finish, find employment, stick close to home to take care of, my mom and my two sisters, my two younger sisters. Mm-hmm. So there was a huge pressure for that. And then it was like, okay, I have a degree. It was in mechanical engineering, but I'm not all that thrilled about it. Mm-hmm. So, what do I do? And and here's where, like sometimes things work out for the best. I in order to graduate, you had to complete a senior project in engineering. Mm-hmm. And my senior project required additional funding that the school didn't have. So we made a pitch to our alumni to see if they can help fund us, and we got the funding for it.
Oh, wow.
Which got me my first taste of higher education administration, because I had no idea that there was an alumni office. I didn't know that you could talk to them. I didn't know that you could pitch them for things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So after I graduated, I found that we had an alumni office, and that they were looking for people to hire. Yeah. And so based on the experience of creating a proposal for alumni for fundraising, my first job out of college was to work for the same institution that I graduated from in the alumni relations office, creating alumni programming and events, and helping with fundraising. So that was my first job, and that actually paid for my second degree.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which was very fortuitous there.
That's so interesting. The path to your second degree, which I guess is on like higher ed administration.
It was well, they still didn't have the breadth of degrees that I was looking for. So the closest thing that I could get to education or to counseling or to the things that I really wanted to do was management. So I got a management degree.
Gotcha.
And which was good, because it was different from engineering, but it was a
little versatile too.
It was a little more versatile. And it helped open up the world to me a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, because I just thinking about your connection and how you got into at least the world of higher ed in your second degree. Similar in some ways, thinking about I stayed on the same path of education, but I was quickly like, I don't know if I want to be a teacher, but I was very involved. It was, I was very involved as a student leader. I was brought into the world of higher education, and, what did that look like in terms of being a student leader, but having really close access, because again, a small school, close access to the dean of students and the directors, and seeing what they did to create community and programming for college students. And I was like, this could be, and being able to be brought in and talk to the president about my experience, and like, I'm like, this could be a cool way to kind of do something that I want to do, but with these older kids, right? Like, and so I was like, interesting. And so I was able to get my graduate degree in college student development and counseling, which was a little bit of a different approach too, because it was counseling based, learning how to really work with people and think through, real life issues, but for, understanding the development of a college student too. So it was different than just like a regular higher education degree, and it was 2 years. And so thinking about just like trying to get, nowadays it's like 4+1, right? And you're like, you have a master's in like 5 years, which is also great.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I was like, oh, 6 years of schooling already, right? And so that whole elongated time till adulthood.
Yeah.
And I did go right after undergrad. I went right into grad school. So I was a grad student, pretty, young. For me, it felt like I was young at the time. Whereas again, now I see a lot of students who are like, going right in to get their master's right away. But for me, that was an interesting kind of transition to higher ed, right? And understanding a new way of showing up for me. And also for me was being a little bit more critical on, I was able to get a scholarship. I was able to have, jobs that paid me well so that I could live in the city and do the thing, right? Like it was a different route to my undergrad, which I felt, again, like I was just like, I pushed myself in, but I was just like thrown in, where at least the grad school, I was like, I knew the process. I remember the process. I was part of the process. I understood what I was getting myself into, so a little bit of a different route in that way.
I didn't go into my master's immediately. I actually started working and I was trying to figure out what kinds of things I could take while I was here. Mm-hmm. I knew that one of the benefits was to get a degree. Mm-hmm. I had to find a degree that was closer or closest to the thing that I really wanted, which I still didn't know. Yeah. So there was a period of trying to figure that out. And the funny thing is, like the first student in your family to go to college is also the first student in your family to go to grad school, and the first student in your family to get a job, a professional job. Yeah. And all of those things were things I had to navigate as well. And although my research was on students who are in the process and in their undergrad, I mean, there were other areas that I wanted to explore, which were, like, well, how did career services work? How did applying to grad school work? How did all of those things work for students who were the first in their family? Because you're still carrying, you may have made it past the gate, but you're still carrying all that baggage you had with you to your next step. Yeah. And I mean, if I told you that it took 6 years to get my 2-year degree, that would be, that would be generous, because I'd start and then I'd stop. I'd realize it was tuition remission, so I didn't have to pay for it. So I didn't feel like I had to rush through it. Yeah. I found a class that I liked and then realized that, juggling class and work and home responsibilities was overwhelming. I didn't know how to manage my time very well. And then I think maybe in the last year, I realized that I got to get my act together. And then I just sat down and did it. And I had half the amount of credits. It took 5 years to get half the amount of credits, and then 1 year to finish the rest of it. So 6 years I graduated with a 2-year degree, but it was, a lot of it had to do with issues that I just didn't know. I mean, how to be a grad student. How to be, how to take advantage of all the resources that were there. And even though I worked at the place, I worked in the alumni office, and then I realized that there's a difference between the administrative offices and the academic offices, and, all of that. And so, that was my education in the the nuances of higher ed. Yeah. At the same time, an education for myself in trying to figure out who I wanted to be. Yeah.
Well, I think I have a syndrome of like tunnel vision for good and for bad. For good is because like, if I at least make my mind up, I'm going to hold on to it for like, I think self-pride. For bad is like, you need to allow a little bit of flexibility in thinking sometimes, right? And like, maybe it doesn't have to go the same route, right? And so that's why I do think that I'm like, hopefully a good advocate to talking to youth about like, you know, don't hold on so closely to like what you believe needs to happen. It's okay to be a little bit, it doesn't have to be so linear, right? You could have a little bit of flexibility because it might pay off for you in other ways later on that you're not even aware of, right? And so it's hard to do when you're 18 and to think about, but I think if hopefully someone that you trust tells you that, or at least again, you're guided in some way, that it will help you kind of think about that in your process so that it's not such a shock. So I think for me, it was more of like, I had no real guidance and I was just like, I got to do this for myself. It's interesting to hear your journey, even the 6 years, but I'll say, I think it was hard for sure, because I didn't know how to be a grad student either. But I think the piece, again, leading to some research, cohort and community is huge, because that was the biggest thing, I think, for all of us, honestly, in my cohort. I think we were like, in the end, we were like, we would not have gotten through this as young higher education professionals, young graduate students. Honestly, a lot of us were literally right out of undergrad. I don't know if we would have gotten through it, right, without each other, right? And so when I think about that, when I think about grad school, I think about the cohort, because I'm like, it literally was this group of 20 so people, and we were all just like, it's hard for you? Oh, good. It's hard for me too. Oh, good. You stayed up till 4 a.m.? Oh, good. Me too. Oh, you didn't, like it was because we were trying to work. We were living our lives. We were like, it was different than undergrad. And so that cohort saved me.
You bring up a great point there, because I think what was difficult for me was that there wasn't a cohort. Mm-hmm. It was just people who were taking this program from all walks of life. And it was a commuter school, so it was the same school I went to. So I was still commuting an hour in and an hour back. Yeah. So people would go in, and lots of stuff was transactional. Mm-hmm. It was, I'm going to class and I'm going home. So I didn't get to know who my classmates were. Mm-hmm. So I never really formed any bonds with anybody who I would, even want to study with or work with. It wasn't until maybe that last year when I decided to buckle down, and I realized I was in classes with at least 2 or 3 people who I knew. And I think that was most of the work in those later classes were project-based. So, now you're working together, and now you're like, okay, here I am in the library after, on a Saturday with folks that, I went to class with, and now we're starting to bond. And that's where, for me, my cohort grew, and I had to form my own cohort, my own group, and I think that was for sure what helped me graduate. Just knowing that this group was here, and so and so has a kid, so and so has to take has to go home. Somebody else has home responsibilities. Like, okay, we're all in the same boat. We're all struggling together. So it wasn't so isolating.
Right.
And I think that's the big thing that first gens suffer through. It's to be isolated and to think that they're alone, and they're not. And sometimes you could take advantage of a cohort that exists. And other times you have to kind of make your own cohort just to survive.
Right.
But I think that both, there are 2 different ways that you can go look at it, and I think both of our experiences slightly different, but it just affirms what we see out there. It brings up to an interesting point in that I didn't know that what I did was had any commonalities to anybody else, because I didn't even know that for the word first generation, that not in my lexicon.
Right.
I went through undergraduate, grad school. It wasn't until a year before I started my doctorate that I had even considered that term at all.
Yeah. Well, you're correct. Same for me. I did not know through undergrad. Grad school is when I found out about it, only because, again, I was working in a higher ed context and actually started working. I just needed a summer job, right? And I actually got my graduate degree from Northeastern, which is where we got our doctorate from. So I know, go Northeastern. But so I was like, oh, there's a summer opportunity. I can work for this bridge program for first gen students. Again, no real context for even what that means, but I'm like, reading the description, I'm like, oh, that sounds like something I can relate to. That sounds like me, but not really even understanding that is me. You know, I'm like, I'm like, oh, that sounds like I could help these students, right? Like, so it was a summer bridge program, and I was a grad student between my first and second year of grad school. And the first gen experience, you know, for them, I'm like, oh, interesting. And I'm like, wow, this is pretty cool that there's a program for these students in this way and all those things. And I was like, wow, I didn't even realize that I was missing something, you know? You know, and then also like, why was this not available for me?
Part of the reason why I wanted to do this kind of work with you was normalize it, to let people understand that first gen could be something that is a buzzword among higher ed circles, among people who are in the know. To the 18-year-old me, you know, would I have understood that?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Probably not.
I don't think so. Mm-hmm. I think it needs to be qualified. There needs to be very clear definitions and clear outreach. Say, hey, are you the first in your family to go to college? We have some services for you. We have some things that you might want to consider. We're here to help you. Those kinds of things are things that would have been helpful to me. Because I don't know, if I saw like a big banner in the hallway that said first gen student lounge, you know, like there's a celebration, I would have been like, all right, what's that? And then just walked past it.
Yeah. No, right. Because again, there is no real, at least there was no education around understanding that student status. So I would be like, oh, that's not me.
Yeah.
you know, and to that point of like years later reading a description of a program and it's like, oh, that sounds like me. Yeah. And like, oh, okay. But I totally agree. I think there needs to be, and I'm glad that we're doing this. I think normalizing it and putting faces to it also, right, helps understand. And I think that's why, you know, I'm glad that we took this time to get to know each other in this way, because you get to see like, oh, these are interesting pieces of just someone's journey, right? That like, without us even saying first gen, right? You would just be like, oh, I gone through that, or that felt similar to me, or, oh, I didn't understand that connection, right? And so I think just being able to talk through, like, just because we have a doctor, right, at this point, at some point, we didn't really understand what we were doing, you know, which is why,
that's for sure,
you know. But now we want to take, you know, this opportunity to, you know, really simplify the experience so that folks can understand how they can get these resources. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about how'd you get into the research of first gen?
So after working in the alumni office, I switched over to the admissions office. And that's where I kind of got my interest in understanding students. So you know, talking to people who graduated from a place helps you kind of see what the potential is. But, you know, you don't really have that much of an impact on people who've already gone through the process. So I went down to the admissions office, and that's where I got my next role. And then I skipped over to another school, another college, where I was in charge of analyzing enrollment trends, and then analyzing student data, and then analyzing student programs and things like that. So a lot of that work had to do with outcomes and outcomes of different groups, and then looking at equitable outcomes, and to see, you know, what pockets of people have we been ignoring that we're taking for granted by giving maybe just a blanket treatment to everybody, and that maybe we could do better as an institution to try and find ways to help. And so I think I was in I was invited to a faculty meeting once, and somebody had come in and started talking about first generation students. And my eyes lit up because I had realized, first of all, that sounded like me.
Mm-hmm.
And then second of all, I realized, have we ever, at this institution that I was working at, have we ever differentiated this group from the rest of the population? And the answer was no. We didn't even record it. And so both personally and professionally, I thought to myself, well, this is something interesting that I want to explore deeper. And I think at the time I had just got accepted to Northeastern, and we were still looking at, they were telling us, to start thinking about a problem of practice that we wanted to tackle. And my initial thought was that I wanted to do student success.
Yeah.
And of course, in a doctoral program, they're like, okay, that's huge. What kind of student success?
Right, narrow it down.
Underserved populations? I was like, yeah, narrow that down even more. Yeah. And I'm like, first gen students. They're like, okay, good starting point.
Yeah.
And so that's how I chose that group, because, for two reasons. One, that was a population that wasn't examined. And two, I realized that was me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in getting this degree, it's almost served two purposes. One was to get the academic credentials and to understand and to learn the research process, but it was also a process of learning about myself. And it was almost like therapy in a way.
I agree. To that point around therapy, I tell people similar, talking to people, giving my advice as best I can. And folks they're like, oh, you got your doctorate. And I tell them, how and why I chose the topic, but I also say, do something that you really love and care about, because you're going to spend so much time with this. And there were days, and I'm sure you can attest, there were days, there were mornings, there were nights that I was like, I don't want to read. I don't want to do that. I don't want to write about this. But then, I'd take a beat, I'd get some water, I'd walk around. And then an hour in, I'm like totally immersed, right? It just needed, always starting up is always hard. But I'm like totally immersed. And I'm like, I would not want to do anything else. I only want to do this, and so to your point around, it was therapy, but it also, I really enjoyed the journey of the research and delving into the topic. So I always tell people, do what you really, well, at least what you think, you really will enjoy sitting with for long periods, years of time.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I reaffirm what you say there. There were times where like, this is hard. This is like, I don't know if I can read another article about this and whatever. But then I download that article. I'm like, well, that's interesting.
Uh-huh.
And then all of a sudden I'm back into it. And if this was something that was just purely academic, where I chose a subject and it was like, okay, I'm just going to study about this, and I didn't care about it, I don't think that would have sustained me. And it's funny, and it is what I found in my own research with first-gen students. It was like there was always that personal connection to the completion of that goal of graduation. Mm-hmm. That was, that's what spurred, a lot of the ones who moved on to graduating. Mm-hmm. That's what spurred them on. It was like, no, I had a vision of what it looked like to finish.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm going for. And whether that is 100% true or correct, this is what it looks like to me now. And when I get there, I'll figure out what the next step is. And I took that to heart as I was doing my own interviews. I was like, oh, that's what's driving them. And I realized it was also what was driving me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was like, oh, I saw what it would look like at the end. And, you know, I wanted to be doing this kind of work and working with these types of students and to
Mm-hmm.
really understand their journey. And that was what really spurred me on to graduate as well.
You know, I got to this research in the same way, thinking about like I want to give back to this community because, as we pointed out earlier, I feel like I was a little late to the game of even understanding my own self, right? And I'll share that it also sparked. I'm like, my mom was first gen. You know, I didn't even understand. I didn't know that honestly. You know, and she was first gen for her family, and you know, again, she didn't finish, but there was so many lost tales and stories there that we didn't even know how to communicate with each other about, right?
Mm.
And so I felt like I was like, I'm doing this for her and for me, but also because I, you know, was really immersed in that same summer bridge program. I ended up working for that office several years later, and was working with those students. And again, that student population, honestly, they're really privileged because it's a scholarship that really looks at them being first gen and provides them with tons of resources, but it's only for about 10 students, right? And so I'm like, only 10 students can reap the benefits of resources, right? And all the things that go along with being a first gen student. And so when I chose the topic, to your point, I still had to whittle down because I'm like first gen of all these different, right? Like subgroups
Yeah.
and categories and things, and they're like, no. So, you know, it ended up just being about low income first gen students, and why they succeeded. Because for me, I was like, I know lots of really academically rigorous first gen students who are doing well, because I do think the narrative sometimes is that these students don't do well or they're not prepared for college. And there's two of us here who, even with all our ups and downs, we made it through to, you know, to the doctorate level.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But, you know, I wanted to talk a bit about that and say like, no, these students can do it, but we also can provide more for them. And so my research was, you know, I wanted to lean into that narrative for this population. But also for your point of being selfish, I want to do it for me and my mom, right? And because again, I was like, all this time, we're the same, you know, we're the same. Wow. Like, and her struggles, it was because of so many of the things that we talk about in our research, right? That was so unknown to her. So yeah, it's just interesting.
It's funny because I mean, my wife's first gen. A lot of the people I graduated with were first gen.
Yeah.
So not knowing that was a thing, it just made me think that this is what everybody experienced.
Yeah.
And it created this illusion that I thought, okay, maybe we're all just lost and struggling. And I didn't realize that like those who are not first gen were not as lost and not as struggling. I just thought it was like the thing that we all do. I didn't realize that I was behind the starting line from the beginning. Didn't realize that. Nope. Because all of these other folks here are standing here with me. Mm-hmm. I didn't realize that the starting line was 100 yards forward, and that, you know, that I had to contend with that my entire life.
And you bring that point up, and I'm like, I thought we were, to your point, we're showing up at the same line, right?
Yeah.
They were actually doing pre-workouts, right?
Yeah.
Like there was
yeah.
There and again, just I'm like, oh, we're here together. It's like, no, right? Like it's interesting about like there's so much to this, and there are students that are showing up at the same table as the first gen students with wealth of knowledge, right? And even if they don't know how to use it, they're still exposed to it, and or could rely on someone and a resource that is able to help them navigate. You and I, we were like, well, I guess this is just what everyone is experiencing, right? Like, I'm just gonna take this situation and maybe move on. maybe not, and maybe internalize it. Who knows, right? For me, it's like just put my head down and keep on going, right? Like,
Yeah. Put my
yeah,
head down, keep going. That's what it was. And I missed out on things like internships. I missed out on things that were, like, oh yeah, you know what, there's additional money in the financial aid office. All you have to do is fill out these forms. Take advantage of the tutoring office because, it's not, there's no stigma to getting additional help. If for the next round of people who are going through this helps in any way, in the least, I'm hoping that see what we've done and see what you could do better. Just as a taste of two people's experiences. And believe me, it's more common than you think.
completely. It's definitely more common than you think. And I think the more we all lean in to it being common, right? And that we can talk about it, right? And there is no stigma, right?
Yeah.
I think we can do a lot of good for the first gen population. So I'm excited for this journey.
I am as well.